I must say, we have an embarrassment of riches on our panel this afternoon, so I'll introduce you to them in alphabetical order. E.J. Dionne is a widely respected journalist and political commentator on NPR and PBS. He is a longtime columnist for the Washington Post and serves as a senior fellow in government studies at the Brookings Institution and is a professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. His most recent book is Code Red: How Progressives and Moderates Can Unite to Save Our Country. Massimo Faggioli is the author of 15 books in English, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese studying post-Vatican II Catholicism. And as I always tell Massimo, I have to lay down when I say that, 15 books in all those languages. He is the winner of the Yves Congar Award for Theological Excellence, and his book, Catholicism and Citizenship, won a Catholic Press Association Award. His most recent book, quite pertinently for our discussion today, is entitled Joe Biden and Catholicism in the United States, and that was just published a few weeks ago. Robert McElroy is the Bishop of San Diego and is widely regarded as one of a handful of public intellectuals among American Catholic bishops. He is currently president of the California Catholic Conference of Bishops. He was educated at Harvard, and he has, count them, not one, but 2 doctorates. His dissertation in political science at Stanford University was entitled Morality and American Foreign Policy. Last, and certainly by no means least, Amy Uelmen is a lecturer in religion and professional life and is special advisor to the dean at Georgetown Law School. She is as well a senior research fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. You might also want to Google her very interesting, I think, an important essay, which was published after the Capitol riot called Whither Dialogue After the Capitol Riot. Ladies and gentlemen, the Boise Center is honored to have the 4 of you today as panelists in our event. So I think I'll do this just alphabetically. So we'll start with E.J. E.J. Dionne, I've asked each of you to offer 3 pieces of advice to President Biden from someone very much involved in the public square. So we'll start with you.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be part of a discussion sponsored by a great center at a great university in a great city that is one of the great sports towns in America. Yes, I'm talking about Jalen and Kemba and Jason. I'm honored. It's also very kind of BC to have 2 people from Georgetown on your panel. I'm honored to be with Amy. Massimo's book is very important. Everybody out there should buy it. And I am such an admirer of Bishop McElroy. A fact about Bishop McElroy, he wrote his undergraduate thesis on the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think that the study of nuclear war prepared him for being a leader of the church at this moment, because I think dealing with nuclear war and its threat was easier than being a leader of the Catholic Church at this moment, and especially the American church at this moment in our history. So it's a real honor to be here. I'm going to give 2 answers to your question. I'll be brief about both, because I think those of us who are involved in specifically Catholic kinds of conversations probably look out there and sort of imagine or pretend that most Catholics looking at a president are looking at him as Catholics. Most Catholics, including very devout ones, including very attentive ones, are looking at him as citizens. And actually, the 3 core pieces of advice I would give President Biden, period, are kill the virus, fix the economy, take care of bread and butter, meaning jobs and wages, healthcare, education, and training for people who need work. And I actually think in terms of our conversation, dealing with remedy to public problems as opposed to extending the culture war, extending religious warfare, might be the best thing he could do for the country and for that matter, for the Catholic Church, which I think could use a lot less emphasis on cultural warfare and a lot more emphasis on remedy and problem solving. The second part of my answer, which is designed to be more Boise Center-like, if I may put it that way, is I have three baskets for the president: family, Francis, and partnerships. I'd like President Biden to recast our conversation about family. I think it's very important. I think the Catholic Church's teaching on family is incredibly helpful and has led to extraordinary social justice breakthroughs going all the way back to Monsignor John Ryan and the family wage. And I think that when we look at family, we should think about the family wage, family leave, childcare, also the child tax credit that's part of this relief program that Senator Romney on the Republican side introduced a version of. So I think that's one basket. The Francis concerns I put in, to some degree, an international basket. Massimo has taught me that as a Northern Hemisphere Catholic, I should realize that Francis gets a little impatient with Northern Hemisphere Catholics as a Southern Hemisphere Catholic. And so obviously with Francis is a general concern about social justice, but I think it's particular call to be concerned with social justice in the world, poverty in the world, and not just in the United States. Obviously, climate change, human rights, and immigration. And the third basket is partnerships. I'll close with that. I have a bias here. My friend and longtime co-author on various things like this, Melissa Rogers, and I did a report back in the fall on how the new administration could deal with faith-based partnerships and other issues surrounding religion and government. There is so much that has been done historically between civil society institutions and our government, including the church institutions as a subset of that large community of civil society institutions. I think another way to pull us together a bit would be for Biden to emphasize that shared work of charity and justice. So in the end, I still think the basics, fix the virus, fix the economy, fix bread and butter, are the most important thing. But I think each of these has a lot to do with those. And again, an honor to be here with such an extraordinary group of people.
Thank you, EJ. I'll drill back to that one because you raised a lot of questions for me. So, but Massimo, you're up.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great honor again. And I'm happy that EJ spoke before me, because what I'm saying is something that the president might consider for the after emergency. So these are maybe dreams, but the first one is something that maybe he has done already, which is an opening to the US bishops. And he may have done that already, but it's something that in a covert way or in an open way could really call the bluff of that small minority of ideologues and of the cultural warriors. And so I think President Biden is enjoying an authority and a popularity that is not really the same of those bishops who are against him. So he has an advantage which he could use. I think that is really something that would be beneficial not just for the Catholic Church, but also for his authority, his leadership. And of course here it's always risky because so there's a risk of playing Constantine a little bit, but I think this is something that would be interesting to see. A second thing for the post-pandemic, post-emergency is this. I believe America needs something like a jubilee. And of course, I mean, I don't imagine President Biden opening the holy door or selling indulgences. I'm not saying this, of course, but in this sense. So when I think about Jubilee, I think about what it meant for Catholics of different nations in 1950, after World War II. it was not triumphalism, it was a signal of a human fraternity in Francis terms. And this is what America needs, probably, because we have gone through a very difficult period of rifts that cannot be solved only with policies. And so those are necessary, but there's something that needs to happen in terms of the moral discourse that has to be ecumenical, interreligious, secular, religious, all of that, as a human family in this nation. The third and the last one is this, is that I believe the United States and the Catholic Church in this country need more or less the same thing, which is something like a synodal path, a synod. So there has to be a new beginning, in the sense that this presidency should tell people that it's not a reversal of fortunes, that now the other party won and every problem is solved. So it's the beginning of a long journey, which is not about cheap healing, where those who committed crimes can go easy free and so on. But it's about, so this idea that one people means only a common path. There's no one people that doesn't journey together. And so I don't know how this can help the Catholic Church in this country having a synod, which is something that Bishop McElroy, as we've spoken about authoritatively a few times. But in history, there's always one correspondence between a certain political moment in the secular sphere and an ecclesial moment. And so I believe that this president and this church need each other. And I think President Biden is in better shape, pandemic notwithstanding and so on, to push a little bit the church out of this corner, I think.
Great. Thank you, Massimo. Bishop McElroy.
Great. It's a great joy to be here with all of you today and to share this conversation, because it's an important moment in the church in the United States and also in our country. I would suggest, first of all, that President Biden try to reclaim patriotism from the mantra, the tribal mantra it has been reduced to, of America first. I think patriotism for Americans is not tribal. We are a people not founded on blood ties. We are founded on certain aspirations that the founders laid out, and in each age we live and we do well in certain of those areas and we fail in certain of those, but those aspirations are what constitute our patriotism. And it's not a possession, it's an aspiration. And those aspirations resonate on so many levels with the content and the concepts and the language of Catholic social teaching, the principles of the dignity of the human person, the common good. And I think that we really have to repossess that from those who have corroded our patriotism and made it into a symbol of everything it stands against rather than what it's for. And I think President Biden, given his personality and his approach to things, could have a very productive role in doing that. The second piece of advice I'd offer to President Biden is that I would urge him always to remember that the most fundamental moral challenge for a Catholic, faith-filled public official in the United States is not in his precise alignment on every position with where the bishops are currently applying Catholic teaching, but rather whether that public official uses an authentically informed conscience to guide him or her in making the key decisions they are called upon to make. And I believe that conscience is going to be really key to the president. At certain points where he's much in tune with Catholic teaching, like immigration, for example, and climate change, because there will be great pressures on him not to do what needs to be done. And he must let his conscience guide on these questions. That doesn't mean he has to do impossible things or hold himself to, but it means that. And also on abortion, what I am concerned about is that the court may come up with a decision which totally changes the architecture of law regarding abortion in this country, and we will be thrown into a vortex. And that would help us in some ways. But I fear it's going to be really important then for the president to make sure that he brings the protection of the unborn as well as protection of women into that conversation as things are really changed. And the final suggestion is pretty simple. I would invite Archbishop Gomez for dinner. Now it's in line in a way with what Massimo is advocating, but I would focus on Archbishop Gomez. In the USCCB, the president has the ability, he set up the working group, all these different things. He has wide latitude. And I think if they were to get together for a private dinner and discuss, and the president could talk about how he carries out his job and how he brings faith to it, and Archbishop Gomez talk about how the difficulties they face in carrying out the role of the bishops of the United States. I think it could be a very productive relationship on a whole range of issues because Archbishop Gomez is not by nature an ideological man. He's a more pastoral man than ideological. So I think that could be a good moment.
Great, thank you so much. Amy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Father Mark. And actually, what I will say has maybe more to do with methods, but it follows on what the wonderful thoughts that we've heard so far. So I was thinking of President Biden's love of history, and also the fact that this is certainly not the first time we've dealt with difficult polarization. And so I found a text actually from 1546 by St. Ignatius of Loyola called On Dealing with Others. And it was to the very busy Jesuits who were serving as advisors to the Council of Trent. And one of their tasks was to make abstracts from Protestant books extracting propositions for discussion at the council. And so I thought, how interesting, right? That their job was to work with the sources of what some considered to be emblematic of division and tee it up for public conversation and policymaking. And so part of what emerges in this is also, I think, the question that is underneath much of our advice, which is how do you sustain personally your energy for this kind of work? And so his first piece of advice, which I just love, this is called On Dealing with Others, is really to get out of reactive mode. And so to slow down the pace and to allow the time for deep listening to inform one's response. And so this is just the text. He says, be slow to speak and only after having first listened quietly so that you may understand the meanings, leanings, and wishes of those who speak. Thus you will better know when to speak and when to be silent. And so I think the first piece of advice is there would be 1,000 ways in which a posture of listening quietly could be very healing for our country at this time. The second is really interesting. I mean, these guys are really busy in the midst of a busy Council of Trent schedule. And he suggests that they still find time to pay attention personally to those on the margins. So he wrote, visit the hospitals at some convenient hour during the day, always taking your health into consideration. So I think he would have said, wear a mask. And then hear the confessions of the poor, console them, and even take them some little gift. If you are at least 3, each one should take turns. visiting the poor a day at a time, twice a week. So it's very precise. And so what struck me about this, of course, that attention will manifest on the level of law and policy. But what struck me about this was the really personal nature of contact with those who are suffering. And I'm sure it meant a lot to the people with whom they were in contact. But I think the reason to build this into really, strong advice is because so that manifestations of suffering in the world remain the horizon of deep meaning, and so and contact with suffering. And this is, if I were speaking to President Biden, I would say this is already your habit. This is already your life. And your life experience, and so just more along the lines of kind of encouragement to stay there. And then the last piece of advice is really great. It's along the lines of self-helps, Ignatius says. And so he says, spend an hour at night when each of you can share with the others what you have done that day and discuss your plans for the following day. And then on one night, let one of you ask the others to correct him in what he might have done amiss. On another night, another will do the same. Thus, each one in turn, so that all can be helped to greater charity and a greater influence in all things. So I think in an office of these heights, maybe the greatest challenge is the burden of feeling isolated and alone. And so my last piece of advice would be to treasure and nourish the relationships where he can work out his ideas, but most of all, the relationships that help to process critical feedback. And I think that capacity is probably the greatest gift that a world leader could receive. And so the order ends of Ignatius. He says, this order should begin within 5 days of your arrival to Trent. And so similarly, you've had the chance to kind of get settled now in the month of February. And so I hope this advice is helpful.
Thank you all very much. Each of you have said many things that I want to pursue, but let me circle back with one question that each of you mentioned that really caught me and asked the other folks to sort of weigh in on this. EJ mentioned a number of things, but one of the things that caught my attention is about not extending the culture war, which I think is still working itself out, as we know, because there was some concern in Washington about people returning to the Capitol today. So EJ, I think you're right on that. Bishop McElroy, Massimo, Amy, what would you say about how could he concretely not extend the culture war? Or do you think he's done a good job thus far? We're only a month into this, a little over a month into this, but what's your sense of how he might do that?
So I think he has done that already. I mean, I think that culture wars cannot proliferate without a pulpit that is used in that particular way. And so we have seen the pulpit of the president being used in that way in the previous 4 years, and that has stopped. So the whole presidency as a moral discourse has changed overnight. I mean, that is one of the shocking things. So here there is, I believe, a more difficult step, which is about policies and sending this kind of signal. That is, we are in power now, and it's not a reversal of front. It's not the whole picture in reverse. It's our turn now, because this would be deadly for the issues, for him, and for our politics. And so it's not about changing who's in charge, but changing the script. That is what I would say.
I think it's difficult to change the language in the universe of discourse. I believe The president wants to do that, and he's tried to do that. And from the White House, I think that's the message that is emanating. But when I look on the reaction that comes to legislative proposals or policy pathways, what's being thrown up against them, why are there no Republican votes for the COVID bill? What does that say? Yes, the language has changed, but I think we're still in a universe that lives under the Hastert rule, where you have to have a majority of the majority of the Republican Party to accept something, and that those who might be willing to move more toward the center are checkmated by the voters who won't go there and who use the continuing language of culture war. And then, of course, as we progress in this, there may be democratic initiatives that spark the same thing on the left. But I think it's one thing to get out of the language and the Twitter and all of those things. That's a very helpful thing. But I think it's a deeper challenge. How do we get out of this political calculus and configuration that constantly reverts back to the culture war on these major issues, where there should be some, if not unanimity, at least broad consensus?
I think the big challenge is many of us are caught in echo chambers without fully acknowledging the damage that's doing to our public conversation. And so I think the deliberate effort to dismantle echo chamber types of consultation takes a heck of a lot of work. And it takes also public work in terms of reaching out and making public the kinds of partnerships that break down echo chambers. So I think we can try and change the script, but until we change the nature of the relationships and acknowledging the damage that they have caused on both sides of the aisle, we're not going to get very far. So it's a big, big task, I think.
Interesting. Massimo, you used the phrase, we need a synodal path when you're using the phrase, of course, the famous theological phrase synod, usually applied to bishops and good bishops. By using the phrase synodal path, what did you mean?
It means a different kind of national conversation that, with that technical term, applies to the Catholic Church, but it reflects the aspiration of one people to be part of a national discourse, which is about participation, involvement, is fundamentally about what, if we think democracy is worth saving. I mean, so there's a coincidence between the crisis of democracy worldwide and the effort of Pope Francis for synodality, because it's his way to move forward Catholicism, but also to say we cannot give up participation and share conversation. So here at the ecclesial level, we know what it takes, because that's happening in Germany. It's happening in Australia. It has just been announced a national synod for Ireland. At the national level, you need to dismantle the language and the assumptions that led to the violent assault against the constitutional order, because this is what we have seen in these last few years. And so, yes, synodal, it's one way of saying a constitutional convention or something like that, which is not about changing the constitution, but it's about who we are. That's what I meant.
Do any of the three of you want to leap in on that, or?
Can I leap in on a related point? First of all, I want to salute all my friends here who've said some extraordinary things. I loved it when Massimo mentioned indulgences with Joe Biden. I've been in Washington so long that what immediately came to mind is, well, Biden's a Democrat, so he would want a fair and equitable distribution of indulgences. And so we'll introduce the Indulge Act of 2021. And Amy, I loved what you said. I would love Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy. He sounds like he should be Catholic. He's actually a Baptist, but have them both invite you to give that talk, a talk around that to members of Congress. It would be good for their souls and maybe all of our souls. And I'm really grateful that Bishop McElroy mentioned reclaiming patriotism, because on this point about synodality, I want to get it right, or or for that matter, ending culture wars. It does seem to me that some of it has to do with either reclaiming or redefining or opening up words we use all the time, and that patriotism can turn into chauvinism and forms of exclusion, but patriotism also leads to extraordinary acts of generosity and the common good. I finally got vaccinated this week. I went to a site at a Six Flags amusement park. It was a drive-through site, and it was a whole bunch of Army National Guard people working with this extraordinary group of healthcare workers. And I have never, not only because I was happy to get vaccinated, but actually seeing these folks work together with incredible efficiency, real warmth to everybody going through it, made me think, yeah, we're a country. We can really solve problems. And so patriotism is one. Family, as I suggested earlier. I mean, we love our families. We care about our children. We know how central, no matter where we are on these culture wars, using the family and that word as an attack word is, to me, just such a scandal, given what it is supposed to mean and what it means day to day to all of us. And the last one, which we can have a whole long conversation on, is freedom, and in particular, religious liberty. Because another thing that pains me about the current conversation is how religious liberty has been turned into a narrow ideological buzzword instead of something that we as Americans are deeply proud of and that ought to characterize our government. Yes, we'll have some legit arguments over how do you balance free exercise and non-establishments. There are big arguments to be had in defining it, but I think it's become not a term to argue about productively, but a term used to exclude and push aside a whole group of people. And so I think we need to reclaim some of these words as common words. And again, that's why I salute Bishop McElroy, because I think reclaiming patriotism is a particularly important piece of this puzzle.
I might just say two brief things. One is, I agree with EJ on the First Amendment, and I think religious liberty. We've got to reclaim what Catholic teaching really is, because what's being bandied about now in the name of the church often is not the fullness of Catholic teaching on religious liberty, particularly as it applies to the conscience of the individual believer in secular activities in society, where in Catholic teaching, the common good is a very strong boundary to that in certain instances. And we had to face that, and that's dropping out of the conversation. But on the synodality question, I had proposed an article about 2 years ago. It was right after the Amazon Synod, because it was such a beautiful experience at the Amazon Synod, that we might think of doing a synod. But the other reason I thought we might have a chance, ecclesially in the US, was we had just come through the Encuentro, the Hispanic Encuentro. And that is a synodal experience. And bishops, lay leaders, women religious, deacons, priests of all kinds participated in that. And it was a synodal experience. And the normal categories of division dropped aside, and there was a focus, and it was partly affective, but there was a focus on what do we need to do as a church in the Hispanic community to move forward and to meet the challenges that face us of making the gospel real in the time in which we live. And that makes me think we can do it. But it also makes me think much of what a synod, even in our own country, a national one rather than just an ecclesial one, would have to be informed and could wonderfully be informed by the cultures that have come to our country and enriched it as they always have. I think it's very non-ideological, and that starts with a different frame of reference. So I think it's more like what Massimo's talking about.
That brings to mind, I think, the question of the role and the place of beauty and the aesthetic and narrative and the stories. And so what does it mean also to really get to know each other and to get to know what are our stakes and what we're arguing about and what we're concerned about. I was just talking with a colleague at Georgetown who had this great idea of just like you would do a junior year abroad where you go to another country and the difficulties of the pandemic. She said, why don't we have like a domestic year abroad or time abroad where you can explore other parts of your own country and the different ways of being and thinking and the stories and the beauty of the diverse cultures. So I think that kind of contact with the life of people and what is meaningful for them also opens out beyond a kind of culture war reductive way of talking and being together.
Father Mark, could I ask Amy a question on that? Because I think that's
whatever
really
you want to
important.
do.
One of the things that I found most troubling about the last 4 years is how many people within their families, when they were politically divided, stopped talking politics altogether. I grew up, my sister's on the call, she'll know, she's experienced this. I had a very dear uncle whom I argued politics with for 40 years until he died. And his kids, God love him, asked me to do the eulogy for his funeral because they knew how much I loved him. And I quoted Richard Nixon in the eulogy just because I thought he might come back to life, just to say, see, I know you'd be quoting Nixon someday. But we could argue and we could talk, and we knew we loved each other at the end of the business. There was that, we seem to have lost even the capacity to do that in the last 3 or 4 years. I'm just curious, what you just said was so beautiful. I was hoping you could inspire me to figure out, will we get out of this somehow? Because at least you can't even have concord before you can actually have, you have to have a civil argument first, and we can't even do that anymore.
I wanted to ask each of you a question, but actually we're getting lots and lots of questions from the audience. So, and actually 2 of the questions are precisely the question I wanted to ask you. So Bishop Backward, one of the participants said, well, how would you open a conversation with Archbishop Gomez? So let's say President Biden does invite Archbishop Gomez to dinner. What would you say?
The way I'd say it, the most important thing I think that could emerge from such a dinner is relationship. Okay. So what I would say, what I'd love to see the first 2 points between them being Archbishop Gomez describe on what his life has been like. You know, he grew up in Mexico. He's from a middle-class family. He came up here. He's been in various dioceses in the country. Particularly as an immigrant and his encounters, immigration is really at the heart of his ministry and priorities. I think on that discussion, they could have a wonderful bonding. And similarly, if Joe Biden were talking about his experience growing up and working in unions and all these different things, what it's like, and they both had families with, you know, good family background. They would share a lot. So what I would hope would, you know, I think it would flow because they would not each come in. I don't think they're the type of person that would come to such an event with, I've got to make these 5 points, but rather I want to get to know this person. And there's a lot we engage on. And it doesn't mean you avoid anything where you disagree, but it means the primary thrust for such a dinner, in my view, is coming to know each other and see your perspective. You know, that's one of the Pope's whole thing is encounter means sitting down with somebody and believing you can learn something for them and forming a relationship with them. So that's
Interesting.
So you don't think he should begin by asking, why did you say I cooperate with moral evils in your
No.
statement?
no.
Boy, that's a conversation I'd love to be on the
Note
wall.
note to self, that would be a bad opening. So it's like,
But Gomez would not begin with that. Anyway, that's not his nature.
right.
So
I was thinking of Biden asking him.
Amy, I wanted to ask you about
Buddy.
Amy, I wanted to ask you about your advice about getting out of the reactive mode, but one of the participants, the viewers here, was, why don't we flip the question? What advice would you give to the bishops about dealing with Biden?
Could we defer to the bishop first?
Yeah, no,
good
okay.
traditional Catholic
Okay, good.
fashion?
Is that okay? Is it okay if we defer to the bishop first, Amy?
Of course, yeah.
Good.
I was hoping you'd say no. Well, I believe our first step as bishops should have been, continues to be, to try to approach the administration and the president as we do all administration. You know, our conference is now 50 years. We just celebrated it recently. And in all of those years, our stance as a conference has been to be in dialogue with the various administrations, which have been quite different over those 50 years, and to advocate, but with a sense of supportiveness in the basic act of governance too. It's not in a sense of opposition to the government. That has never been. We do oppose certain things as bishops, so we make that clear, but that's different from being oppositional to an administration. And so I think that stance of the past 50 years should be the stance the conference has and the bishops have from now onward. And
Amy, do you want to weigh in at all
On all of this, right?
on all of the above? Yeah, that's right.
No, I was just thinking of a conversation I just had with one of my students about cognitive empathy, and so that cognitive empathy is distinct from agreeing with everyone or anyone. And so this sense of conveying the idea that you understand how somebody gets to a position, or you understand how complicated it is, and you enter into the arguments and the moving parts. It doesn't mean you capitulate and or you just lay down in terms of, having something else to say. And so I think the work of cultivating a capacity to listen in order to understand the complexity of politics and of law. A lot of our problems, I think, in understanding each other also lie in the difficulty of understanding the limits of the law and the limits of the legal system. So that would be, I think, an area where we would need to open out a much more nuanced and more thoughtful conversation, but out of the heat of the spotlights, with a little bit of calm and a little bit of study and a capacity to really go in depth. I think we need much more nuanced thinking there. So that would be one suggestion. And I'll just return to EJ's question before of, how do we imagine? I think part of what's been going on also is we tend to kind of catastrophize, to say we have to try and figure out how to change everybody's mind or the most extreme person's mind in my family, right? And so I think the work of finding another person who is different enough, who can help me hear how I sound in somebody else's ears, and can be a kind of conversation partner that helps me slow down my reactions on Facebook or Twitter, or even in family fights, that can make a world of difference at family dinner tables and family Zooms of all kinds. So that would be just one idea.
I love that. Could I answer the question real quick?
Sure.
My answer, what should the bishops do? First, listen to McElroy, Tobin, and Sue. I think that's very important. Oh wait, did you lose me there?
Yeah, you lose. Say that again, EJ.
Oh, I said the first thing is listen to McElroy, Tobin, and Supich and pay attention to what they've been trying to tell you. The second thing I would say is reread the 1919 Bishop's Statement on Social Reconstruction, which is a remarkable document in and of itself, but it's a particularly interesting document because that came after the last great pandemic. And there was a great period of introspection about social justice. It was at the end of a terrible war and a pandemic. And I think there might be some guidance there. The third is to remember something I saw on the Q&A that came up before, and it's about the extent to which young people are leaving the church and religion altogether. And that what you are seeing in the political sphere is reverberating with young people in ways that I think are not helpful to the faith. It sounds like a kind of hostility to values that is very good values, I think, that a very substantial number of young people hold. So those would be three beginning pieces of advice. But if they probably get the rest of it if they just listen to McElroy, Tobin, and Supich. So
Okay, I'll sign that document if you want to write that up. I'm going to merge two questions that have come together. One viewer said this, and I think whoever this is right. Catholics are famous for saying we're listening. Well, we're not listening at some point in fact, but we're sort of famous. As a community, we've done a lot of that. We say we're listening and we're not. On the other hand, all of you, I know, as have I spent a long time reading John Courtney Murray, about which Bishop McElroy and all of you have written. And Bishop McElroy and Murray was very much concerned with what he called the civil conversation. The civil conversation as the basis for American culture and American political culture. Do you want to offer anything that John Courtney Murray wrote about in terms of the civil conversation that might be useful either to the president or to the US bishops in terms of like entering into a civil conversation with those with whom we often disagree, sometimes strongly disagree?
I would just suggest one element of Murray's thought, which was key to him and touches upon a number of the topics we've talked about, and particularly the synodality question Massimo brought up. Murray was really writing in the 40s and 50s, and he was much affected by the consensus school of American history. So he believed, the consensus school actually argued that there was a consensus in America. Why was America exceptional? It didn't have these radical revolutions. And the answer being, people like Hofstadter and so forth, Bursted, that there was a consensus within the country. Now, I have to say it was a pretty white bread, middle class consensus. It was an Eisenhower Republican consensus in a way. But for Murray, it was different. The consensus was not something to be grateful for or something to rely on. It was to be an ethical construct. There was a continuing aspiration and goal of the society. So it was a conversation. It came out of conversation, and it came out of bringing together enough people in the society that would ascribe to certain goals, knowing you're going to reach them partly and not reach them. But we have not had that sort of conversation, and we certainly don't have that sort of consensus. And it would be a great thing to shift toward. But it was not, again, not a possession, not aren't we great? It was, for Murray, an ethical, cutting critique on our society as well as an aspiration.
I may, 1 second. So it's interesting because in the same week my book was published in Italy, the same publisher republished the Italian edition of John Courtney Murray's We Hold This Truth, which was published in '65 in Italy. And I reread that. And there's one thing that I find particularly useful in our context in the effort of de-escalating from the culture war. John Courtney Murray says the articles in the American Constitution about the freedom of religion are not dogmatic articles, they are articles of peace. This is very important. So here there is I think it's admirable, is resistance to dogmatizing a few tenets of Americanism, because we know John Quincy Murray has been used by the right and by the left in many different ways, in a dogmatic way. And so I found that incredibly telling of our moment, the way he was describing the American Constitution.
I would add to this, it's a two-part article. I think it's called A Theology for the Layman. And it just blew my mind in terms of the resources for shifting tone for lay people. And it seemed just so, such a preparation for the council. And there's a great line that says, lay people don't need apologetic little band-aids. And so shifting from a tone of apologetics to a much more positive, engaged, constructive tone for how we're dealing with the various disciplines and the world around us. I think that's an extraordinary piece of work. And if I can suggest, Father Mark, it would be make a great webinar to take those documents and really open them out as part of the work that the center is doing. It's a fabulous, fabulous resource.
Point taken. That's going to be written down and acted on. So EJ, do you want to address the Murray question at all? Or?
No, I just appreciated Bishop McElroy making the point that Murray was rooted in the consensus theory of American history, which of course came under sharp attack within about 10 years later. And I personally have a very complicated relationship intellectually with Hofstadter, because on the one hand, I admire him, love his writing, and he's full of insight. And at the same time, I think his reading of movements of protest was unfair, to say populist and the like. But I think for us today, thinking about Murray, it's always worth remembering that so many of the architects of the council's ideas, including Murray, but others as well, were actually put outside the framework of Catholic thought by the Vatican and others, and that they had to fight. It was people on the outside who came under some attacks, who eventually altered the way the church looked at the world in a useful way. And I think that's a kind of lesson to all who want to, and this happens on sort of on the left side sometimes as well, all who want to close off and keep out insights. And eventually Murray really helped revolutionize the church. And so did a number of other people kept out of the, ruled out as unorthodox in the 40s and 50s.
Interesting, good. This is very interesting. One of the viewers has written about this to put us in a time machine. When the University of Notre Dame in South Bend announced that Obama was getting the Laetare medal, there was an outrage. I come from a Notre Dame family, so I heard this firsthand. And then, of course, in an almost Solomonic way, they announced that both Biden and Boehner they're going to share the Laetare medal, which was kind of an interesting way of doing this. Is that a model for what we can do as Catholics? I mean, does that Notre Dame moment, is that useful for us to think about how we could move forward? Massimo?
No one wants to comment on Notre Dame. I understand. I believe, that's one solution. As a European, honestly, I have to say, I'm amazed by the measure in which everything in this country and in this church has become Republican versus Democrat. It has really become a metaphysics. And so my effort would be to look for someone who's not a third party, but above, or saying something that are uncomfortable to both sides, to everyone, to Notre Dame, to myself. So that is what I feel that is missing.
I almost feel like saying, and I'm not sure this is right, maybe as long as we are so divided as a church, every university is probably better off not honoring any politicians for a period of 5 years until we sort out a way not to beat each other over the head. But I'm not even sure I believe that, because I'm not sure they should stop bringing in politicians. But there's something just so rancid about our own arguments with each other that as soon as you make a choice, you are going, you know, particularly if it's a Democrat these days, you're going to come under enormous attack. And I don't know how I'd like us to get out of that.
Well, I have made the argument to several university presidents in such circumstances that I actually think they'd be better off not having polarizing personalities of any type at commencements, because I come at it from the students and their families.
Yeah.
You know, if it's a polarizing speaker who might be terrific, you know, as a speaker and as what they're doing in society at certain levels, so my question to the president is always, who is the commencement for? And if it's for the students and families, we're probably better off similar to where you are, EJ, not doing for a while. But the wider question is, how do we think of public officials and giving them that respective office, which the church has continually said is important to have? If we critique, yes, office holders, but we also show the respective office. And I think that's what's endangered in all of this.
And the irony of Notre Dame is, if you read that Obama speech, it was an extraordinarily loving speech toward the Roman Catholic Church and the importance of the church in his life. The Catholic Church gave him his first salary as an organizer. And it was just, there was such a disconnect between what he said in that address and the attack on him. But maybe I'm just showing my partisanship here.
Yeah. And certainly, I think I would agree that I think having, as an academic who sat through, I can't remember how many graduations I've actually sat through. I always bring my copy of George Herbert's poetry with me to read, just in case. So I've
It's a
actually
hard
much
speech
better.
to give.
Exactly. And George Herbert is a hard thing to beat, actually. So I think I won. I want to thank all four of you. It's been an extraordinary conversation. We weren't able to get to everybody's question, but I think you are exactly what I said I wanted to do, which is I want to get four very smart people on the same Zoom moment and talk to each other about these very difficult questions. I want to personally thank you, and thank you in the name of our viewing audience for addressing some very tough questions, addressing them sort of like in a serious and sophisticated way, which we, unfortunately, in the past year of politics has not always been the case. And I hope we can continue this. This will be the first of, I hope, many Zooms with the four of you, where we can pursue some of these questions and maybe get to some of the questions from other viewers who we were not able to get to today. So thank you very much. Thank you, EJ, Massimo, Amy, and Bishop McElroy. And don't worry, you'll be back. So thank you. Take good care, all right?
Can't wait to see you in person, Father Mark.
And likewise, ditto.